The story of the 10 plagues of Egypt is a foundational narrative in the biblical tradition, detailing God's intervention to free the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. According to the book of Exodus, the Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt for centuries, and God raised up Moses to lead them out of bondage. But before Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, would release the Israelites, God sent a series of plagues upon the land. Each plague was a demonstration of God's power, aimed at breaking the will of the Egyptian Pharaoh and showing his superiority over the Egyptian gods. The story begins with Moses receiving his divine calling from God at the burning bush. God revealed his plan to Moses, explaining that he had heard the cries of his people and was ready to act. Moses, though reluctant at first, was given the task of going to Pharaoh to demand the release of the Israelites. God assured Moses that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened, and it would take a series of devastating plagues to convince him to let the Israelites go. These plagues were not only acts of divine judgment, but also symbolic demonstrations against the false gods of Egypt. The first plague began when Moses, accompanied by his brother Aaron, approached Pharaoh and demanded the release of the Israelites. When Pharaoh refused, Moses stretched out his staff over the waters of the Nile, and the river turned into blood. This first plague was a direct challenge to the Egyptian god Hapi, who was believed to be the god of the Nile. As the water turned to blood, fish died, and the river began to stink. The people were unable to drink from the Nile, and the water remained unusable for 7 days, causing widespread discomfort and panic. Despite the severity of the first plague, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. God then instructed Moses to initiate the second plague. Moses and Aaron stretched out their hands over the waters of Egypt, and an overwhelming swarm of frogs emerged from the waters. Frogs covered the land, entering homes, beds, ovens, and kitchens. The Egyptians were helpless against this infestation, and the sight of frogs everywhere became a source of immense frustration and disgust. Once again, Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites, even though he begged Moses to end the plague. Following the cessation of the frog plague, Pharaoh again hardened his heart, prompting the third plague. This time, God instructed Moses to strike the dust of the ground, and the dust became gnats. Tiny and irritating, the gnats covered both humans and animals throughout Egypt. Unlike the previous plagues, this one was particularly relentless because the gnats seemed to be everywhere, causing misery to everyone they touched. The magicians of Pharaoh's court attempted to replicate this miracle but failed, and they admitted to Pharaoh that this plague was indeed the finger of God. The fourth plague brought even more terror. This time, God sent swarms of flies upon Egypt. The Bible describes these flies as vast and numerous, filling houses and covering the ground. The swarms were so thick that they disrupted daily life, spreading disease and filth. In contrast to the previous plagues, God made a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. While the Egyptians suffered from the flies, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained untouched. Pharaoh offered to let the Israelites worship their God in Egypt, but Moses insisted on total freedom for his people. Still unwilling to let the Israelites go, Pharaoh's refusal led to the fifth plague, the death of livestock. God instructed Moses to deliver a plague that would strike down all the cattle, sheep, and goats in the fields. This plague had a devastating impact on the Egyptian economy, as livestock were vital for agriculture, transportation, and food. Once again, the distinction between the Egyptians and Israelites was made clear. While the livestock of the Egyptians perished, those of the Israelites remained unharmed. Yet Pharaoh's heart grew even harder. The sixth plague marked a turning point, as it was the first to directly affect the bodies of the Egyptians. Moses and Aaron took handfuls of soot from a kiln and threw it into the air, causing painful boils to break out on the skin of both humans and animals. This plague brought great suffering, as the Egyptians found themselves afflicted with sores that covered their bodies, causing immense pain. Even Pharaoh's magicians were affected and could not stand before Moses because of the severity of their boils. Still, Pharaoh remained unmoved, and his heart was hardened even further. The seventh plague brought a catastrophic hailstorm, unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. God warned Pharaoh that if he did not release the Israelites, a storm of hail and fire would fall upon the land. Many Egyptians, fearing the power of God, sought shelter, and protected their animals. However, those who ignored the warnings suffered greatly. The hail destroyed crops, animals, and homes, causing widespread destruction. The fields were left in ruins, and only the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. Despite the devastation, Pharaoh still refused to let the Israelites go. After the hail subsided, Pharaoh called for Moses and admitted his sin, promising to let the Israelites go if the plague was lifted. Moses prayed and the hail stopped, but once again, Pharaoh changed his mind and refused to release the Israelites. This act of defiance led to the 8th plague, in which God sent a vast swarm of locusts to cover the land. The locusts consumed every green plant left by the hail, stripping the land bare. The sky was darkened by their sheer numbers, and Egypt's agriculture was left in total ruin. Yet Pharaoh, in his stubbornness, did not relent. The 9th plague was a supernatural darkness that fell over Egypt for 3 days. The darkness was so thick that the Egyptians could not see one another, nor could they leave their homes. It was a palpable darkness, unlike anything they had ever experienced. During this time, the Israelites continued to have light in their dwellings, but the Egyptians were plunged into complete and terrifying darkness. Pharaoh called Moses and agreed to let the Israelites go, but demanded that their flocks remain behind. Moses refused, insisting that they must take everything with them. The final and most devastating plague was the death of the firstborn. God warned Pharaoh that if he did not release the Israelites, every firstborn in Egypt, from the household of Pharaoh to the lowest servant, would die. Moses instructed the Israelites to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, so that when the angel of death passed through Egypt, it would pass over their homes. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, causing a great outcry. Pharaoh at last relented, and the Israelites were set free. With the death of his own son, Pharaoh was finally broken. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and ordered them to leave Egypt immediately with all the Israelites. This moment, known as the Exodus, marked the end of Israel's long period of bondage and the beginning of their journey to the Promised Land. The 10 plagues had accomplished their purpose. They had demonstrated God's power over Egypt and its gods. They had secured the freedom of the Israelites, and they had left a lasting legacy in the memory of the Jewish people. The plagues are often interpreted as judgments against specific Egyptian deities, demonstrating that the God of Israel was supreme over all the gods of Egypt. For example, the Nile turning to blood was a direct attack on Hapi, the god of the Nile, while the plague of frogs may have been a rebuke to the goddess Heket, who was associated with fertility and had the form of a frog. Each plague not only brought physical suffering but also challenged the spiritual and cultural foundations of Egyptian society. The 10 plagues also serve as a powerful symbol of liberation, showing that God's justice will prevail over oppression. For the Israelites, these plagues were not just acts of divine intervention, they were a testament to God's faithfulness to his promises. Throughout the story, Moses reassured the Israelites that God had not forgotten them, even in their darkest hours of slavery. The plagues were the means by which God demonstrated his commitment to freeing his people and leading them to a new life. As the plagues unfolded, each successive event seemed to deepen the divide between Pharaoh and his people. While many Egyptians began to recognize the power of the God of Israel, pleading with Pharaoh to release the Israelites, Pharaoh's heart remained stubborn. This stubbornness is a key theme throughout the narrative, illustrating a conflict not just between God and Pharaoh, but between arrogance and humility. Pharaoh's refusal to submit to a higher power mirrored the pride of many leaders throughout history who believed they could defy divine justice with impunity. The 6th plague, the boils, was particularly humiliating for Pharaoh and his court. Unlike previous plagues that targeted Egypt's land, animals, and water, the boils inflicted personal suffering on every individual, including Pharaoh's advisors and priests. The magicians who had once been able to replicate Moses' signs were now powerless, afflicted with painful sores themselves. This physical torment was a reminder that no one, not even the most powerful figures in Egypt, could escape the reach of God's judgment. Yet even this personal suffering was not enough to soften Pharaoh's heart. By the time the 7th plague, the hail, descended upon Egypt, The land was already weakened by the previous calamities. The hailstorm, described as the worst in Egyptian history, was accompanied by fire and thunder, further demonstrating the raw and unstoppable power of the God of Israel. While some Egyptians heeded Moses' warning and sought shelter for their animals and crops, many did not, resulting in widespread destruction. The hail ravaged the remaining crops, leaving Egypt on the brink of famine. In the face of such destruction, Pharaoh momentarily wavered, acknowledging his sin, but his resolve hardened once more when the plague ceased. The eighth plague, the locusts, brought Egypt to the point of collapse. Locusts are a terrifying symbol of unstoppable destruction, consuming every plant and piece of vegetation in their path. For Egypt, an agricultural society dependent on the Nile's fertile banks, the arrival of locusts signaled economic and social ruin. Every green thing left by the hail was devoured, leaving behind a barren, desolate land. Pharaoh's officials, realizing the gravity of the situation, begged him to let the Israelites go. Yet Pharaoh, consumed by pride and a desire to maintain control, refused, leading to further devastation. When Moses stretched out his hand to bring about the ninth plague, darkness fell over Egypt for 3 full days. This was no ordinary darkness. It was thick, oppressive, and terrifying. The Egyptians could not see each other or move about their homes. The sun, a symbol of Egypt's most revered god, Ra, was blotted out. This was a direct challenge to one of the central deities of the Egyptian pantheon, as God demonstrated his power over even the sun. The darkness was a fitting precursor to the final, most devastating plague, which would strike at the heart of Egyptian society. The darkness also served as a stark contrast to the light that continued to shine in the homes of the Israelites. While the Egyptians were plunged into a suffocating, disorienting night, the Israelites were protected and untouched. This clear distinction between God's people and the oppressors highlighted the growing separation between the two nations. The Israelites, once enslaved and powerless, were now being set apart by God as a people destined for freedom. This separation would reach its climax with the final plague, which would forever change the course of both nations' histories. Before the final plague, Moses was given a solemn task: to prepare the Israelites for their imminent departure from Egypt. God provided specific instructions for what would later become the Passover feast, a ritual that would be commemorated by the Israelites for generations to come. Each family was to take a lamb without blemish, slaughter it, and smear its blood on the doorposts of their homes. This blood would serve as a sign to the angel of death to pass over their homes, sparing their firstborn children. This act of faith would mark the Israelites' transition from a people in bondage to a people redeemed by God. The Passover ritual held deep symbolic significance. The lamb's blood was a sign of God's covenant with his people, marking them as his own and protecting them from the coming destruction. It was also a foreshadowing of future sacrifices and deliverance, with many later drawing parallels between the Passover lamb and the sacrificial system of Israel's future worship. For the Israelites, this was not just a moment of survival, but a defining act of faith in God's promises. As they prepared for the night of the final plague, the weight of centuries of oppression hung in the balance. As midnight approached, the anticipation was palpable. In the homes of the Israelites, families gathered in hushed silence, eating the Passover meal as instructed by Moses. Outside, a sense of dread hung over Egypt. And then, at the appointed time, the Lord passed through Egypt, striking down all the firstborn sons in every Egyptian household, from Pharaoh's palace to the poorest peasant's hut. The cries of mourning echoed through the land as families discovered the lifeless bodies of their children. It was a night of unparalleled grief and sorrow, the likes of which Egypt had never known. For Pharaoh, the death of his own firstborn son was the final blow. His pride, which had kept him from acknowledging the power of the God of Israel, was now shattered. In the middle of the night, he summoned Moses and Aaron, ordering them to leave Egypt with all their people, flocks, and belongings. There would be no more negotiations, no more delays. Pharaoh had been utterly defeated. The Israelites, who had long dreamed of freedom, were now at the threshold of a new beginning. The exodus from Egypt was at hand, and God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was about to be fulfilled. As the Israelites prepared to leave, they did so in haste. They gathered their belongings, took the unleavened bread they had prepared, and followed Moses out of Egypt. The Bible notes that they also plundered the Egyptians, who, in their desperation to be rid of the Israelites, gave them gold, silver, and clothing. This act of plundering symbolized not just the material wealth that the Israelites would take with them, but also the complete defeat of Egypt. The Israelites, once slaves, were now leaving as a free people, enriched by the very nation that had oppressed them. The Exodus was not just a physical departure, but a spiritual journey as well. The Israelites were leaving behind not only the land of their oppression, but also the gods of Egypt. They had been witnesses to God's mighty acts of judgment, and now they were called to be his people in a new land. The plagues had demonstrated to both Egypt and Israel that the God of Israel was not like the gods of Egypt. He was a God of justice, power, and faithfulness. As they set out on their journey, the Israelites were beginning a new chapter in their history, one that would be defined by their covenant relationship with God. Yet the journey ahead would not be easy. Though they had been freed from Egypt, the Israelites would soon face new challenges as they crossed the wilderness toward the Promised Land. The memory of the plagues and their miraculous deliverance would sustain them, but they would also be tested in their faith. In the coming months and years, they would face hunger, thirst, and the threat of enemies. But through it all, the God who had brought them out of Egypt would remain with them, guiding them through the wilderness by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The story of the 10 plagues and the Exodus is more than just a tale of ancient history. It is a timeless narrative of deliverance, justice, and the triumph of faith over oppression. For centuries, it has served as a source of inspiration for those who have faced their own struggles against tyranny and injustice. The Israelites' journey from slavery to freedom is a powerful reminder that, no matter how insurmountable the obstacles may seem, God's justice will ultimately prevail. The plagues were a testament to his power, but they were also a reminder of his mercy, as he spared his people and gave them a new future. In Jewish tradition, the celebration of Passover continues to be a central ritual, commemorating the events of the Exodus and the 10 plagues. Each year, families gather to retell the story, reliving the night when God delivered their ancestors from Egypt. The Passover Seder, with its symbolic foods and rituals, serves as a reminder of both the suffering of slavery and the joy of liberation. The story of the 10 plagues is recited, and the blood of the Passover lamb is remembered as a symbol of God's protection and provision. The 10 plagues have also been the subject of much theological reflection. Some see them as a demonstration of God's absolute sovereignty over creation, with each plague targeting a different aspect of the natural world: water, land, animals, weather, and even the human body. Others view the plagues as a moral lesson, showing that pride and defiance in the face of divine justice will ultimately lead to destruction. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is a key element of this lesson, as it illustrates the dangers of resisting God's will, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of his power. In conclusion, the 10 plagues of Egypt serve as a profound narrative of divine intervention, justice, and liberation. The story encapsulates the struggle between human pride and divine will, with Pharaoh's stubbornness acting as a cautionary tale about the dangers of resisting God's authority. Each plague was not merely a physical event, but a symbolic act targeting the heart of Egyptian society and its deities, ultimately showing that the God of Israel reigned supreme over all creation. Through these trials, the Israelites were not only freed from physical bondage, but were also spiritually set apart as God's chosen people, destined for a new life in the Promised Land. The significance of the 10 plagues extends beyond the historical and cultural context of ancient Egypt. For people of faith, the narrative remains a timeless symbol of hope, liberation, and the triumph of justice over oppression. The Passover, which commemorates the Israelites' escape from Egypt, continues to be celebrated today, reminding generations of God's unwavering commitment to his promises. Whether viewed through the lens of theology, history, or moral reflection, the story of the 10 plagues continues to inspire believers to trust in God's deliverance, even in the darkest moments of adversity. Ultimately, the story of the 10 plagues is a powerful reminder that divine justice prevails over human defiance. It inspires faith in the promise that, no matter the challenges, liberation and redemption are always within reach for those who trust in God's plan.
Thanks for watching our latest videos by clicking on the video in the screen, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.